Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Cathy O'Neil, who is the founder of an algorithmic auditing company called Orca. We'll have to talk about exactly what algorithmic auditing is. She's also a research fellow at Harvard University and the author of two books. Most recent book is called The Shame Machine, Who Profits in the New Age of Humiliation. Also the author of Weapons of Math Destruction, How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. Welcome, Cathy.
Thanks so much, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Well, look, both of these books cover old topics with new dimensions, right? So when we talk about shame, for instance, I mean, shame has probably been around as long as we have been social creatures, and has been used for good and for ill, but technology enables you to do it kind of at scale, right?
Yes.
And so that could have both good and bad consequences. We'll have to talk about that. And also, weapons of mass destruction. I mean, people have been making decisions. They've been classifying people into different buckets for as long as they've been, making decisions in a social context. And new technologies allow you to do this at scale. And that also has sort of, beneficial and potentially harmful consequences. And so I guess maybe what we can talk about is, technology has been an enabler, and you've got people on the one side who talk about how amazing it is, right? That we can scale all of these things at low cost. And then there's been other folks that have been critics. And sometimes, it's often the case that you're either one or the other, right? And I think what you've tried to do is demonstrate that there are, in fact, both benefits and costs to this technological scaling. But I think you're emphasizing the harmful effects, perhaps because they are underemphasized in the kind of story that we tell, particularly here in Silicon Valley. I think that we tend to emphasize, right, the benefits. I know certainly in my classes, I will spend most of the time talking up the benefits. I'll talk about the harms as well, but I guess it would be fair to say that I spend 80% of the time on the benefits and 20% of the time on the harms. So do you think that there is any fundamental difference between the potential harms that we have now in the world of technology, or are they just sort of the same harms that we've always had, but kind of on steroids?
Same harms we've always had with what? Like with everything?
Well, in other words, the pathologies that are associated with shame and the pathologies that are associated with classification in general. I mean, is it a matter of, can we, if we were, for instance, teaching a course on the harmful effects of classification, the harmful effects of shame, 50 years ago, without all this technology, we'd probably be teaching things that are very, very similar, right? Hey, you got to be careful about false positives. Hey, you got to be careful about, shaming people about things that they, have no choice in. I mean, is it really, are we talking about the same harms except on a larger scale, or are there fundamentally different types of harms that we have as a result of the technology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the answer is kind of both, in the sense that, like, you're right that shame is not new. Shame is as old as social interaction, and sort of it's absolutely required for a functioning society. We have to know how to sacrifice our personal goals and selfish desires for the sake of the group, which I think is the fundamental rules around shame. And yet, and for that matter, exploiting people for commercial purposes using shame is nothing new, right? As long as there have been wrinkles, there's been wrinkle cream, or like other ways of trying to enhance your physical look to seem younger. That's around. That's been around for thousands of years. We know that. The question though is it, so it's not new in that sense, but it's new at the scale is so high. It's so massive. It's TikTok viral for teenage girls and boys. So in some sense it is new because you didn't have massive numbers of 12-year-olds insisting that they need wrinkle cream or other kinds of body lotions and skin lotions in the past. That just wasn't a thing. That was a thing that only women of a certain age were vulnerable to until relatively recently. For that matter, like body image stuff, which has always been around. There's always been a type of body that you're supposed to be, and if you don't have that type of body, then you should feel ashamed. That's not new, but the scale of shame, and it's related to, but and there's like a reason I wrote both of these books. Like I worked in ad tech, so I knew firsthand because I did stuff with tailored advertising, like what it really means to profile people on the internet, and like what it means to sort of suss out their vulnerabilities in various ways, their propensities in various ways, like what likelihoods of them for clicking and buying a certain thing. So I know what scaling looks like, and that is new. So that's a new technology. We just didn't have that much information about people in the past. I mean, if you look at the history, I don't know, Greg, it sounds like you know statistics. Maybe you teach statistics. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, then you know that the history of statistics is the history of not having that much data and just doing as much work of milking the data that you do have as carefully as possible to try to get some milk, and that's one of the reasons you don't see classical statistics used that often, really, in modern day technology, like internet stuff. Like it's just not, because we have so much data. But the problem isn't that we don't have data. The problem is that we don't have the data we exactly want. So we're constantly using the data we have as proxies for what we want. So like it's the signal that's gone down, but the amount of data has gone way up. But it's really, really new. It's really, really new. And we weren't able in the past to find the specific people that could be shamed about a specific type of skin problem, and be convinced to buy a particular product that doesn't work, but will make you feel like you're trying to accomplish getting rid of the shame. This is again, it's like an old idea, but it's being honed into a new kind of problem for humans.
Well, when I talk about recommendation engines, sometimes I'll talk about it as if we are returning to the era where the shopkeeper knew the customer as an individual, right? So,
Yeah.
if you were in a small town back in the old days, your great grandfather would walk into the store and the merchant would be like, "Oh, great to see you again. I've got those special pickles that I know you love." And then, we went through this period of mass consumption, big cities where you were just an anonymous customer, walking into the store. And now, even though you're dealing with Amazon, they know you, right? Kind of as well, maybe even better than that small merchant might have known your great grandfather. So, when we think about the shaming, right, at the kind of granular level at which the shaming takes place that you talk about
Yes.
so well in the book. I mean, isn't this in a way just going back to our small village ancestors, right? Where your neighbors knew absolutely everything about you, and so they were probably able to micro target you in such a way as to enforce conformity, right? I mean, because that's really what shaming is all about, right? It's about the enforcing of conformity around behaviors and characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, I actually make this argument quite directly in Weapons of Mass Destruction, where I talk about like the old bankers that would refuse to give loans to women and or people of color out of just pure, racist and sexist policy. And then the sort of FICO score was introduced as literally as a way to comply with anti-discrimination law, and it really did improve things for those people. And now we have, as you point out, like we have online payday loans or whatever, online, and of course credit cards and bankers actually have to comply with anti-discrimination law, but not all online offers are compliant, and they you know they have as much information about your gender and race as they care to, because it's on all for sale. So yes, I agree that it's like it is it's going back to an older time, and it could be as toxic as older times, or as useful. I mean, of course, like if you were talking at the very beginning of like, we could talk about the benefits, we could talk about the harms. I tend to emphasize the harms because it's easy to talk about the benefits, and the benefits are actually, and I know this because I used to work in this field, like the benefits are working for the people who built this machine. It's important to remember that the data scientists, the business people who've built this machine benefit from it, and they're also the spokespeople for it. And the question is like, who's gonna vouch for the folks that are on the other side? I remember I gave a TED talk, I think in 2017, about these themes in Weapons of Mass Destruction. And I had spent the last 3 or 4 years interviewing people that were subject to algorithms, to scoring systems that decided whether they're worthy of a job, whether they're worthy of being fired or not being hired in the first place, whether they're worthy of a loan, whether they're, surveilled truckers, and what I've gotten used to is just this idea that this is happening to me. This technology is happening to me and is making my life worse. And when I got to the TED conference, I talked to literally the other side of the flip side, the people who are building these things. And they almost universally were like, oh, technology is working for me. And I just remember being like, oh, this is a real difference. Like the folks that think that this is happening to me versus the folks that think this is happening, like, this is benefiting me. I'm going to be smarter once that chip gets implanted in my brain. Whereas like some people will be like, once the chip gets implanted into my brain, it's going to tell me exactly how hard I need to work. There's a real difference in that. And I think that, yeah, so I think it's really important to understand both sides of that debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think people who are advocates of the use of these algorithms, right, they will say, yeah, occasionally there will be some people who will be denied credit as a result of this, who perhaps should not be denied credit. But for every person who is denied credit because they have a below average score, there's another person who is provided credit because they have an above average score, right? And, and for every person who is kept in jail because of these probation algorithms, there's another person who is released from jail because of these probation algorithms, right? And so by emphasizing all the people who are harmed, you're ignoring all the people who are benefited, setting aside of course, the creators and the the marketers of the algorithms. I mean, there are people who are.
Let's go there, Greg.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true that a lot of these things do benefit a lot of people. I mean, for sure. I'm not trying to debate that. And in fact, I'm certainly not trying to say, let's not use algorithms. What I am trying to suggest, though, is that algorithms, first the big data marketing thing, and now AI, are sort of marketed as being good for everyone, like a tide that lifts all boats, but that's certainly not the case. So the point is, there might be a one-to-one correspondence, although I think that would be unlikely for the people that are like that lifted versus the people that are put at risk. or denied by these algorithms, but it's not idiosyncratic. It's not statistical noise independent of anything. It's actually typically along the same sort of socioeconomic demographic lines that historically it was. So there's a reason I mentioned, loan officers who didn't give loans to Black people or to women. It's because those are the people that get denied. So like if you go back to the early sort of what is it called? It was called the fintech, lending club advertising copy. It's like, oh, we're going to use your Facebook friends, the Facebook tree, tree of like friends, to decide who's a good bet for loans. And it's basically like if your friends are rich, you're going to get a loan, even if you don't have good credit, even if your credit file is skimpy and weak and you don't really qualify for a good credit score. Like if your friends and family have good credit scores, we're going to give you credit. That's like the reading between the lines there. Well, guess what? That correlates to wealth. It correlates to all the things. And I just think that's a sort of general, I don't just think, that's my company, algorithmic auditing. Like I do the math, I do the statistics, I measure it. I see that is the case. And so it is very correlated with race and well, even more correlated with wealth. And so that, I mean, to be clear, you introduced my book quite kindly. The subtitle of my book, Weapons, is how big data increases inequality and threatens democracy. And like, this is the increases inequality part of it, right? So what I realized I was doing when I was a ad tech data scientist was I was making lucky people luckier and making unlucky people unluckier. And what I mean by that is I'm like, people like you make lots, buy stuff. We're going to give you opportunities to buy more stuff you like. But guess what? Data scientists have figured out people like you who don't buy so much stuff because you don't have so much extra money, we can still make money off of you. It's just exploitative. And so that is like the sort of the chutes in the ladder of the system. So it is not idiosyncratic. That's the real point. It's like there might be just as many people going up the ladder as falling down the chute, but who among us are going up the ladder? The people that have extra cash in their pocket. So that's why it increases inequality.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we can't do an RCT, but it would be interesting to know whether or not it's increasing inequality more or less than we would get if we had kind of more human decision making. Because it seems like human decision making also increases inequality. I mean, I remember when I was, I went through a period of my life where it was I couldn't get credit.
Right.
It was impossible. I had paying like 35% on credit cards. And, I was like, this is so stupid. I mean, here I am, like I've got an Ivy League education. I've got all these degrees, I'm clear. I'm definitely going to be somebody at some point. Like, why won't anybody give me a loan? And it was because of the algorithm that was being used at the time.
Right.
And I thought, wow, if they just had more granularity, like if they knew more about me,
Yeah.
if they knew how many books I read, if they knew my work ethic,
Right.
if they knew all this other stuff, then I would get a loan. And so, the question, I guess, is the type of decision making that we're doing now, which is much more reliant on data, worse than or better than what we would have if we were to rely on more humans? I mean, I guess, what's the benchmark? I know when every time a Tesla crashes, everybody's saying, there you go, there's that algorithm. But, at the end of the day, you've got to look at the data and see, are Teslas on autopilot crashing more or less than, ones that are driven by carbon-based, processing?
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's a worthy question.
Or is it just better to say, hey, let's continue to hold out for something that is better than we have in either world?
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, listen, I'm a mathematician, right? So by training, I'm a mathematician. So it's all about what are our axioms here? Like, what are we holding constant when we do this sensitivity test? Are we holding constant that people are kind of shitty, racist, and sexist, and also classist and ageist and ableist and all those things? And we're like, assuming that people continue to be kind of awful and anti-discrimination laws are written down but not enforced, are algorithms making things worse than they would otherwise be? And the answer is probably not. Like, I would say that with that pretty crappy assumption, which I'm just going to go with for a second, like the worst you could say is that algorithms, we might think algorithms are making things better when they're not, and that's a harm in itself. Like, we should be like, hey, these algorithms are continuing the same shitty behavior that humans. I hope it's okay to swear on your podcast, right?
Yeah, sure.
I do think we could do better than that. I think we could. I feel like the promise of big data, at least as I understood it, was that things would get a little bit better, And the good news is we could make things better. Like, actually, with algorithms, even like algorithms don't lie. Humans lie, although there are sociological ways of testing humans that don't lie, like with those large scale studies that keep getting done, about applying for like a bunch of equally qualified candidates applying for like law school summer internships and seeing like whether Black names or white names or women or men get more interviews. And you still see problems, maybe fewer or a slightly smaller gap than 20 or 30 years ago. By the way, that was recently redone by a Bloomberg journalism team with ChatGPT. Same thing. Like, they found the same thing. Great example, I think, of like how ChatGPT was trained on crappy human data, and then it echoes that crappy human behavior. Like, we shouldn't be surprised by that, So the question is, can we do better? And the answer is absolutely we can. And we should, I think, unless we really don't want to do better. Like, and of course, then there's an even deeper question of axioms and like, what are our assumptions here? And it's like, do we have to do the thing that is seemingly compelled by pure capitalism? I mean, so anti-discrimination laws are actually not capitalistic. They're basically saying like, we can't just do the most profitable thing. If we just did the most profitable thing, it would be racist and sexist. It would allow guys who read a lot of books and graduated from Ivy League schools to get loans before anybody else their age group gets loans, because yes, you are a good bet in this particular society and you're a better bet than anyone else. Is that the world we want? So it's really, for me, it's really a philosophical question. What I want us to do is to slap ourselves in the face and say, this doesn't have to be like this. We don't have to walk like, we're not the robots. We're not automated. We don't have to have the moral imagination of a ChatGPT, which is to say zero. We don't have to just say, whatever happened in the past, we're going to predict to happen in the future. We can do more than that. And that's kind of what my goal is to say, do we want these anti-discrimination laws? And if so, how are we going to enforce them? And what does that actually look like when it gets down to the nitty gritty? And like, it doesn't have to be just about anti-discrimination. It doesn't just have to be sexism or racism. Those are great examples, but it's more a larger question of like, how do we want our society to be now that we have all these helping technologies? Who is it helping? Who is it ultimately helping? If we have Spotify stealing all the money from music creators, and we have the various Gen AI stealing all the content from artists and from writers, and who is that benefiting? Oh, Microsoft, OpenAI, Google. Like, that's the system we have created. And it's not the fault of the computers. They're not conscious. It is the system we've created, we've agreed to, and we continue to agree to until we don't.
Yeah, I mean, you talk a lot about the gap between what people think the benefits of algorithms are and what we actually get in practice. And, you lived through the financial crisis at a hedge fund. Right? So you saw this gap in person. And as an economist, my natural tendency is to look for who benefits, right? Cui bono, right? If there's a flaw, I usually think somebody's making money from it. But again, there's this rule or law, and I forget who said it. Who said, before you look for bad actors, just look for stupidity. Right? So, do you think that this gap is primarily due to our being asleep at the switch and just being ignorant of the shortcomings, or is it more sinister?
Well, you'd have to be a little bit more precise about which gap we're talking about.
Well, I mean, for instance, when we look at the financial crisis,
Yes.
there were people I know who had faith in their algorithms. They thought, oh, these models are so sophisticated and, we've thought them through so well that they can't possibly fail us, right? And then, of course, you dig deeper and you realize they made all sorts of faulty assumptions and so forth. But, some people would say that was actually intentional, right? That you privatize the benefit, you socialize the harm, and there's really no reason to dig too deep into the flaws in the model because there's no way that you could benefit from having a better model.
Mm. One thing you forgot to mention when you introduced me, Greg, is that I was actually in Occupy Wall Street for like 8 years. So this is.
No, wait. Were you at the hedge fund by day and then Occupy Wall Street at night? Like, how did that?
I quit the hedge fund, and I actually worked at a risk company to try to I quit the hedge fund in 2009, and then I worked at Riskmetrics trying to redo the value at risk model for credit default swaps, post crisis. It'd be for 2 years, and it kind of did, and then I realized nobody gave a shit because they didn't want to know the risk, and I realized, oh wait, this whole thing is a cover up, not to be a conspiracy theory, but literally nobody cared. The too big to fail banks were like, we don't care about our risk numbers. Going back to your original question of is this because people are dumb? And yes, in some sense, you could say but all terrible things are caused by people who are kind of dumb and just following the footsteps of the people in front of them. And everyone can always claim, I just was doing that because it seemed like that's how I made money. And I had kids and a mortgage, yes. Having said all that, it's just, there's so many ways to go about the next sentence, but did people know better? Yes. The people working in credit default swaps knew better. They knew that value at risk didn't actually give you any notion of the risk of credit default swaps as a market in bad times, because they were only doing a look back period of really quiet times when nothing changed. So it didn't, using essentially bell curve assumptions, you're certainly not going to have a notion of what it will look like when shit actually hits the fan. All of the stuff we were doing at our hedge fund trading, I was in futures, assumed infinite liquidity, not in, that's when we were building the systems. And then the unraveling after the 2007 kerfuffle screwed up every single model that we had. Could we have seen that coming? Yes, we could have. But the getting was good when the getting was good, so we didn't, because everybody there was like, I've got a 3-year plan to get the hell out of here, So, and then if you follow it to today, I would argue that the last few years, because my attention has shifted, as many people attention has, from the finance industry to Silicon Valley, that the orchestrated, lobbyist prepared visits of first Zuckerberg and now Sam Altman to Congress to say nothing to see here, don't look behind the curtain. That is absolutely intentional. It is meant to engender trust in geniuses. I put that in air quotes. And in technology as sort of a solution to something that just doesn't deserve that kind of trust at all. It deserves scrutiny that unfortunately our Congress and can't really set aside the attention that it would be required to really scrutinize. Although there are people who are trying.
Well, look, I mean, a lot of the problems that we have in more complex algorithms are similar to the ones we have with our simpler algorithms, like, data leakage and so forth. But it seems like with the more complex algorithms, the problem we have is opacity, right? That we don't really have visibility into what goes into the model. And I used to say that the great thing about, right, a standard model is that you actually have more visibility into what's going on than you have inside the human brain, right? So if a loan officer denies a loan, we don't know what they're thinking. Maybe they think, I remember when I went to get my first mortgage, I wore a tie because I thought, hey, people with ties get mortgage. I mean, like, who knows?
And you're probably right,
but if
Greg.
you
You're probably right.
Right? But if you have, little did I know that this guy was just reading out the output from some algorithm up in Greenwich, Connecticut. Had no idea whether I was wearing a tie or not. But if you have a FICO score tells you, gives you a reason, gives you a justification. And with these more complex models, particularly the ones that are proprietary, we have no visibility, and so that kind of allows all sorts of errors and mistakes to kind of go unchecked because we don't have the checks and balances in place. I mean, is
Yeah,
that one
Greg,
of the
I
key
couldn't agree
problems?
more. Absolutely, absolutely. And like, I just got a paper, like an article describing my approach published in the MIT Sloan magazine. But like, my approach is basically, we need a cockpit for every algorithm. Just like you wouldn't get into an airplane that doesn't have a cockpit and some pilots keeping track of all these dials to make sure that the altitude is high enough but not too high, and there's enough gas in the tank, and that speed is the right range. Like, where is the cockpit for the Facebook news feed? Where is the cockpit for Google search or any of these things? And what does it mean? What are the dials in that cockpit? What are you trying to measure? What could go wrong? What's an existential risk, if you will? If you think of a cockpit as containing dials, each of which represents some previous disaster, like, oh, we got to keep track of that too. Okay, new dial, just imagine it that way. Then I feel like the way we get a hold of the risk that's embedded in a large scale, high impact algorithm is by building a cockpit and keeping track of the dials and building the metrics carefully and saying, what are we trying to measure? How big should it be? What's the min? What's the max? And let's have a little alert that goes off if it goes outside this range. We don't have anything like that for most of the massive algorithms that are affecting our lives so massively.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the notion of a data scientist Hippocratic oath, or doctors and lawyers. They have the AMA, ABA. They have this kind of they're like self-regulating with a code of ethics, and you can be disbarred or stripped of your medical license if you violate that code in some way. I mean, how would we implement that, let's say, for data scientists? I mean, first of all, there's no clear division of who is and who isn't a data scientist.
Right.
Would we want to do something like have in banking, we have these internal risk departments, but then we also have external credit rating agencies, and then we have regulators, right? And to some extent, the regulators now will defer to the internal risk modeling agencies, and they'll have kind of private back and forth because they presumably want to keep these risk models proprietary. So how would we implement a policy where there was more oversight on how these algorithms were used?
Okay, well, that's two different questions. One of them is like about a kind of society for data scientists, and I'll talk about that, and I'll separately talk about how do we implement a system that regulates risky algorithms. But I would say, I've been working a lot in insurance. I've been working with regulators, in fact, like with insurance commissioners, to talk about what does it mean to actually enforce anti-discrimination law in insurance. And it's really interesting. It's state by state, so it's totally different in different states. But as a result, I've been talking a lot to actuaries who have a really pretty robust system of not only like the notion of an actuary, like the definition of an actuary, like these tests that you take, and here's how qualified you are as an actuary. You're qualified to do this, but not that. They have a very good, I mean, it's a guild. So in that sense, it's like benefits the people who get through it, and people have arguments against guilds. But you know what? We all want our doctors to pass the medical exams.
Well, what it means is they have something to lose, right? If you don't have anything to lose, then getting kicked out doesn't really, deter.
They have something to lose. So I think that'd be great. Now, that's separate from the question of what's the system we would want in place. And, obviously there were problems during the crisis of going back to 2007, 2008 with the credit rating agencies, the AAA rated mortgage-backed securities, and the secrecy thereof. And like, really, they were not proprietary. They were effectively known to the investment banks, because the investment banks got to game them, got to say, how about this one? How about that one? How about this one? When do I get AAA rating? And that's kind of, in my opinion, all the access you need to understand an algorithm. Just to be clear, like you earlier mentioned, like we need more transparency in algorithms. Nobody wants code. Nobody wants the code base to Google search. In fact, it's probably literally impossible to get that. It's certainly literally impossible to implement it on your own machine. You just can't, right? It's too big. But what we do want is pure total access to experimenting on it. That's the way I do algorithmic auditing. I need access to the algorithm, or sometimes if it's like an adversarial audit, because I get hired by attorneys general all the time to look into like, how did this student lending company work, or this car insurance company, like were they exploiting, or payday lending? What instead of getting access to the algorithm, I literally get access to every single customer that's ever gone through the algorithm. So that's kind of enough, right? That's enough.
So it's like forensics. You reverse engineer the algorithm.
I don't reverse engineer it explicitly, though, just to be clear, Greg. I don't write down the code that would have produced those answers. I say, how did this kind of person get treated versus that kind of person get treated, to try to differentiate treatment of different classes of people. But it goes back to the same thing, which is like, I'm trying to explain, English language questions about the way this algorithm works without actually trying to reestablish the code. Anyway, to finish my sort of, that was a little bit of a tangent, to finish my thing about a system that would work better. I don't think we just want to transplant the system that we saw in finance, because it was a problem. And it is still a problem. I'm the first one to admit that my field, which I kind of started, right, algorithmic auditing, I would think I was the first one to put a little shingle out that said I'm an algorithmic auditor. I saw it coming when my book came out in 2016. My problem is that I can't, as an algorithmic auditor, insist on good standards of my clients, right? My clients basically are like, I want you to audit this algorithm. I don't want you to tell anyone the answers. I don't want you to tell them what tests you ran or the answers were. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, okay, that sucks. I'm going to do it because I don't have any other clients and I need to pay my bills. And I need to also learn how to audit algorithms. And I need to know how disability insurance works. Like, I need to know disability insurance claim algorithms. Like, what are you doing? How are you doing it? How could it go wrong? I need to know that so that I have expertise. But ultimately, what I want to see is a system where regulators don't just accept proprietary results that are secret, but rather have requirements for open methodologies and sort of public results. Because, by the way, the results of an algorithmic audit do not expose IP whatsoever. Going back to my previous thing, I don't want your code. I will never use your code. I will not expose your code either with the testing. I'll just say, here's how this treated people. That doesn't sort of, you can't back out the code from that. So there's no IP risk here. People don't want that public disclosure, of course, but if everyone had to do it, then it would be a fair system. So that would be the kind of thing I would ask for.
Yeah, I mean, I had some friends who started a company that did, recruiting and hiring, and they discovered that the browser that you used predicted your productivity, your absenteeism rate, and all of this other stuff. And so they incorporated it, into their algorithm, right? And then they went and published an article about it and broadcast it to the world, which meant that they no longer had, it became less effective over time, perhaps because people were, reading these articles. I doubt it, but I
I
mean,
doubt that. I'm guessing it's just that because people started using different browsers.
exactly. It turns out Internet Explorer was the worst browser, and people stopped using Internet Explorer for other
Yes.
reasons, right? But I mean,
Well,
that's the
it's
kind of thing.
typically, as most of these things are, it's a marker of wealth. People
Yeah, so
people
it'd be very
using that.
difficult. It would be very difficult for you to kind of reverse engineer that unless you had access to that metadata, right?
Well, you do have access to that meta. They obviously did.
So they're going to
That's the kind
present
of
you with, well, because no, what they're doing is they're having applicants fill out these forms, and they answer all these questions, and then there's a column which mentions the browser they're using, so they can configure the website. So if you didn't have access to that file, right, then it would be difficult for you to reverse engineer it. So external auditors, would presumably need to have access to the
So
files.
that would be an example of, oh, for sure. I mean, I would need
Yeah.
to have access to. Well, to be clear, let me back up for a second. Like, if I had total access to the inputs as well as the output, one of the inputs
Yeah.
would be the browser. But I don't really need access to the inputs if I'm looking for like disparate impact, right? If I just, but by the way, nowadays, instead of Internet Explorer, which by the way was a marker when I was working in travel, like Expedia or whatever, we definitely used Internet Explorer. It's like, that was a sign. But nowadays, it's like, are you on a computer or your phone? Because that's the new marker of like the divide, right? And that's information that people use all the time. And so it's like, it's a sign of poverty if you're using your phone to do something official, right? Rather than a laptop or a desktop. But like, I don't actually need to know that input if all I'm looking for is like whether these people of this race didn't get the offer. Like, I can still see that this offer went way fewer times to these people of this race. In other words, I can figure out the impact on the racial impact of the decisions without.
So all you need is like the racial column, and then a few other predictors that people are allowed to use, and then
honestly, sometimes all I need is like and by the way, I build the racial column. I build it because I use inferred race. People don't almost never provide their race, so it's inferable with a methodology called BIFSG, which is derived from the census, because that's where people actually write down their race. And like, if all I need is the first name, last name, and address, which most of these kinds of companies collect that if you're applying for insurance or a student loan or something like that. So I can infer the race, and then I need to know the outcome. It's really two columns to start with. And then, or if it's a hiring algorithm, which sometimes I work on, you might want to know, well, qualifications. That would be another column. How do you have a related degree? Do you have years of experience? How many years of experience you have? Like, you would want to account for sort of legitimate reasons to prefer one candidate over another. And so those would be the columns. But I don't really need to know the nitty gritty of all the inputs, as long as I have the information of what happened to this person, what were they qualified for versus what happened to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to turn to your book on shame because this is this has been another example of how technology has weaponized something which has been around for a long time. And so maybe we could start just by saying, what is the role of shame? Shame, it seems like it is a way to enforce conformity, but often, most the functional aspect of it would be to enforce behaviors, right, that are pro-social. But oftentimes it essentially is just looking for markers of community, right, belonging.
Yes.
Things which are not a product of choice. And that's always been true.
Yeah.
So how is kind of the use or abuse of shame been made more harmful with these new technologies?
Yeah. So yeah, pardon me for just saying a couple things to answer that question. Like the first thing is that sh- conformity might seem like the most obvious goal of shame, and I guess in useful examples of shame, like when you shame your child for, you know, beating his little brother. That's a great example. Like, you can't do that to their little brother. Shame on you. That's a great example of pro-social. There are other goals of shame, and it should be said because it'll make more sense as to why it's gotten out of hand. And one of them is setting an example. Like shame. Look at this person. Look at what they did. It's like too late for them to not do it. They did it, right? But we're going to use them as an example for everyone to see of what's going to happen to you if you do it. So it's more like a signpost than a conformity thing. It's, I guess, sort of trying to get other people to conform in the future rather than to conform that person
Hmm.
behavior. And then, so I would call that the secondary goal of shame. And then there's a tertiary goal of shame, which is also really, really important when we have this discussion, which is, look at me. I'm in charge of rules. Like look at me. I'm the enforcer, and I get to be congratulated for having people know the rules and enforcing the rules. So this kind of like a performative aspect to shaming, which I'm sure you already know where I'm going with this. So like when you think about social media, and they're the most obvious example, not the only example, but it's so obvious that I'm going to just go ahead. Like we've talked about how shaming in order to profit is not a new thing. And so, with respect to beauty products or whatever, of course, what with the advent of, e-commerce, it's much, much more targetable. So you can target the teenage girl with acne and say, be ashamed of your acne. Here's a product, right? So you can target that unbelievably well now. You can target people who have an addiction to gambling and just get them. It's possible now because we have such good data about people. So that's something that's been supercharged. But that's not even what I really mean. What I really mean is that the social media platforms have done something really extraordinary. They've built a new business model. It's no longer necessary to implicitly and explicitly shame someone and make them buy a product from you. That's the old business model. What they've done instead is built a world, which is the online world, a platform where they get you to shame each other. Like you are doing it. Like you're
So you
co-opted, if
profit,
you will.
not, so you can profit from the people being shamed, but you can also profit from the shamers.
You profit from the existence of shaming fights on your platform because the longer those guys engage in their shaming, the cross shaming, let's call them shame trains, like longer they get on those shame trains and ride as hard as possible, the longer people are on your platform, and ultimately you're selling their attention. And so they're there, so they're paying attention to the ads around them, which is really, really the business model, as we all know. So it's like this magic trick that they've managed to pull, which is like they get us to shame each other. So they don't even have to get their hands dirty except by their design. And their design is perfected to get us to fight with each other.
Mm.
And so what that looks like, of course, is being able to criticize somebody that's not quite in your norm group. So you said shaming is really about belonging, and I totally agree. Like part of the conformity of shame is like we all agree on this rule, this norm, and you haven't followed that rule. Well, guess what? Not everyone agrees to that rule, and so you immediately defined like I would call it a norm group, like this circle of people that agree on that rule. They're going to agree with you. They're going to shame that person. They're going to redo your post, whatever that looks like, retweet it or like it or share it, because you are so great for performatively shaming that person. But what does it look like from the outside of that group? It looks like you are just completely wrong. You're outrageous. What terrible behavior. You're trying to punch me, but I don't even agree with that rule in the first place. How dare you? And that splinters the norm groups into smaller and smaller groups. It gets people to fight. But the overall thing it does is it makes money for the platform because we are caught up in this system. And it's really quite ingenious.
I teach a course on strategy, and of course, we always start every case with, what industry are you in, right? Are you in retail or manufacturing? And so I think we need a new SIC code for the shame industry.
Yes.
Right? And if we were to kind of do look at the political economy of the shame industrial complex,
Yes.
It's clearly a growth industry.
Yes.
But it seems unclear whether it would be maximized by having, a single set of norms or fragmented norms. So when we think about things like body image, right, it seems like there's something there is kind of unified. There seems to be a central vision. Oh yeah, young is good, right? Fit is good, right, and so forth. But then there's other areas where you have masks are good, masks are bad, where it makes sense to have these fragmented communities that are fighting with each other. I mean, which of these do you think? I mean, do you need both to really maximize your profit in the shame industry?
Well, I mean, Greg, I hate to inform you about this, but there's something called the body positivity movement where no, you don't have to be skinny. You don't have to be young. For every norm you think of, there's splinters. And
So that group would then shame the people who are have body negativity.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Right. So there's shame and counter shame.
Yes. Welcome to modernity. That is
Right.
the whole point of being on Twitter at this point, or whatever it is. Yes, it is to say, no, you're wrong because blah, and then to be retweeted, So yeah,
and then sell products to both groups. There was a couple of the ads that you
that's your
talked
question
about.
though, Greg. It is the absolute answer to your question is you want splinters, you want factions, you want fighting, angry, and completely earnest arguments that last for days because that's how you make money. That's the answer, unfortunately, because I would love to see a day when all of us are just like, you do you, good for you. I don't have an opinion on this. Can you imagine not having an opinion on something? I remember when I was a mathematician before I went into finance and started having opinions about everything, not having opinions. And it was really blissful. I did not have opinions about things. And now it's exhausting to have opinions. I got off of all social media because I was like, I actually don't have enough brain power to have this many opinions in a given day.
And do you think it's because people? Do you think it's because people desperately want community of some kind, and this satisfies their need for community?
That's a great question. No, I don't. I think it's because they were sold a bill of goods to say Facebook is about connection and community. It never was. And instead, it's about habituating someone to have opinions and get this weakest form of pleasure center stimulation by getting re-liked or whatever it is, reshared. It is not community. It is literally oh, someone noticed me in that ether, and it's not as good as going down to the bowling alley, if it still exists, and bowling by yourself, right? That was the point of that book, right? You could get community with nature better than you can get community online, as far as I can tell. I'm not saying nobody ever built a community. And of course there are exceptions. There's always the good. And there's, I could make the case that the internet has been wonderful for communities. But it also has been decimating to our actual lived life. And, my teenage sons, I have 3 sons, but my teenage son, his newest phrase is screenager. And I just feel it says it all, he's oh, another screenager. All these kids, zombies attached to the pleasure center stimulation, like they're addicted. It's an addiction, and there's no other way of saying it. That's not community.
Well, what's interesting is you talk about the pathology of shame in the sense that shame is supposed to induce a change in behavior, but oftentimes it does the opposite, right? So
Yes.
if people are addicted, or if they are poor and they're shamed for this behavior, then that actually makes them less likely to take action, to do anything about it.
Right.
And
And,
it
Greg,
seems
to be clear, yeah, go ahead.
it seems odd that we would have evolved a mechanism that doesn't deliver the results for which it's intended.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that beautiful question. Like, I mean, it's like, and that brings me to the notion of punching down versus punching up shame. Like, a lot of the for-profit shame industrial complex is devoted to shaming people on things that they have no power over. I call it choice and voice, like shaming people based on their body, which people don't really have control over their body. Although you could argue now with Wegovy and Ozempic, that's changing a little bit in terms of their weight. It's still not there. People don't have that much power over poverty. They don't have as much power as you might think over smoking. And to shame somebody for stuff that they feel helpless to change only makes them feel bad and sometimes get worse. And of course, sometimes it makes them buy stuff. And so that's sort of, I feel like the origin of it is the extent to which it can be capitalized. But it has extended to the extent to which it can be capitalized in the sort of social media sense of capitalizing just for the LOLs.
So then that means it's important to promote the notion that these characteristics can be changed and that they are a product of choice, right? So, if people thought that skin color was a choice,
Right.
that you could change it with products, and you weren't changing it with a product, then then there would be shame. And if everyone agreed that it was something that couldn't be changed, then it would be much more difficult to shame someone. So in order for the shame to persist, there has to be at least this illusion or belief that it can be changed. I mean, you walk through all these, the diet industry and the wellness industry, and how people will just engage continuously in these futile attempts to perhaps lose weight. And when it fails, they usually blame themselves rather than the snake oil that they're being sold.
Right. It's interesting what you just said. Like in other cultures, like India, there are skin whitening products, and people
Yeah.
do buy them. So it's
But
important.
I was interviewing someone who was talking about he had a burn scar on his face, and he
Yeah.
said that when he would walk around in America, he would feel shamed, and when he went to India, he didn't, because in India no one could afford the plastic surgery, and so no one
Yeah.
it would never even occur to them that would be something that you ought to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I also just want to make the point that you kind of just theoretically argued that racism could not exist, because how could we shame people for their skin color because they can't change it? Like we do anyway. So I don't want to say there are any actual hard rules on this, but I do think you're right that part of our ability to shame people in an unfair way is our ability to project choice onto people. We do project choice when there is less choice than we think or we want to think. And I do think a lot of fat shaming, in particular, is like based on the assumption that you don't have any willpower. You're just a glutton. You're intentionally eating too much. That it is within your power to do different, and you're choosing not to. There's a lot of that, and it's really harmful. To your point. And then the other example you brought up, which I think is really interesting, and I spent a lot of time on it, and like maybe it's not timely at this point, but it's like the choice to wear a mask or not, the choice to get a vaccination or not. And most of the time those really are choices. And then the question becomes, to what extent does shaming somebody for or did, because we don't do it anymore, but what extent did shaming somebody for not wearing a mask actually affect people's choices? And then they started wearing masks. And I think the answer is actually quite a lot. I think quite a lot of people only started wearing masks because of shame. We heard from the people that refused to, even after they were shamed. But I would say that in vaccination, people didn't generally get vaccinated, but they did in this situation. It wasn't only because they might die if they got COVID. It was also because they were like, I was told I need to get vaccinated to protect my grandmother who I live with. And I don't want to do it, but here I go. So it just brings up another topic around this whole thing, which is, again, related to social media, which is like the sort of selection bias of the kind of topics that you get. One of the things that is true about the algorithms, that are the feed algorithms on all the social media platforms, is that they are chosen to provoke. So it is almost like the algorithm has figured out in your norm group what would provoke, what would outrage you the most, and we're gonna feed that to you, to get you riled up, to get you to fight over this, and to get you like to splinter if necessary, to profit for us. But yeah, they think that the issue of choice is really interesting. And I would say, like, my advice at the end of that book, I have a lot of advice about Silicon Valley companies, but like my advice personally, especially as parents to children, is like, don't overestimate the choice involved when you're shaming someone. You have to really be explicit about, is this really a choice? And if it is, then instead of shaming somebody, try to persuade them. And the way you persuade somebody of something, which is typically more successful than shaming them, is you appeal to a universal norm, which is to say you appeal to a norm that you both really know you agree on. Like the one, you want to protect your grandma. You live with your grandma. Let's protect her. Let's go get vaccinated together. That's much more convincing than shame on you for not getting vaccinated. That doesn't work as a persuasive technique, but appealing to a universal norm does often.
But I think this implies that as our choice sets get bigger and bigger, this will fuel more shame, right? So there are a lot of things that we couldn't do anything about in the past, like baldness or, erectile dysfunction or,
Yes.
bodily, shapes and our gender and so forth. These are now things that we can choose, right?
Yes.
And so they will now become even more subjects of shaming, perhaps, than they have been historically.
Greg, and that's a really great point. And so the question then becomes, in a dystopian future, like, are we just going to spend even more than 24 hours a day shaming each other on social media, or what's going to happen? And I don't want to sound like overly rosy about this, but like I look to the young people who are, some of them are terribly addicted to the shame that they experience and perpetrate, but a lot of them are just like opting out. They're opting out. And I would argue, even though this is another source of controversy and a huge amount of shaming online or even in politics, like the gender fluidity of young people, which was a revelation to me, as the mother of young people with gender fluidity, it's just like, what? Great. Like, let's just let everyone do themselves. Let's let them be who they are. And like, it's not a source of shame anymore because we're just opening it up. And I'm wondering if that could be a future that we could look forward to.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, shame can be used for good. And you talk about how the Me Too movement, right, flipped the shame from the victims to the perpetrators. At least
Yes.
That was the goal, right?
Right.
And that was the hope.
Yeah. And, and we're seeing the nuances of that particular movement coming through. It's not as, both sides are disappointed, I would say, which is probably appropriate. Like, I just was fascinated by the stuff about Alice Munro hiding the abuse of her daughter by her second husband. And I'm just like, okay, here, Me Too is coming for Alice Munro, and that's a good thing.
Well, Cathy, thanks so much for joining me. These are both interesting books. Shame Machine, which really digs into how technology has expanded the shame industry, and also Weapons of Mass Destruction. Let's chat again soon.
Thanks so much for having me, Greg. Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.